Everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the 79th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We acknowledge we meet on the unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. We're meeting today in hybrid format as allowed for under the standing orders. We don't have any witnesses virtual, do we?
No.
Okay, for those members participating virtually, you know the drill. I'm not going to spend time on it. We want to hear from our witnesses. We're going to go right to our witnesses for opening statements. Before we do that, though, I just want to introduce and welcome our panel. We're going to go in alphabetical order today, and so starting with the Métis Nation of Alberta, we have Andrea. Make sure I have all of the the orders. Andrea Sandmeyer, President, Métis Nation of Alberta, joined by Audrey Poitras, former President of Métis Nation of Alberta. Welcome. From the Métis Nation of Ontario, we have Margaret Froh, President, and welcome. And then for also from Ontario, Mitchell Case, Regional Councillor, Region 4, Métis Nation of Ontario, so welcome. And then finally, last but not least, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan's representative, Michelle Leclerc, Vice President. So welcome to each of you. And I know that you've waited a long time to be able to come and join us at our committee. We're going to give each of you 5 minutes for your opening statements. And I have a handy card system here. So when there's 30 seconds left on the clock, I'll give you the yellow card. And then when the time's up, I'll give the red card. Don't stop mid-sentence, wrap up your thought, and that'll be the same when we get into the questions. Just a way of keeping things flowing without having me jump onto the microphone and interrupt you. So just look up once in a while, and I'll ask the members to do the same thing. So if you're ready, I'll keep track of the time. I'll give you the flag when it's time. But if you're ready, Ms. Sandmeyer, and if you're doing the opening statement, the floor is yours when you're ready.
My mic is on.
And just so you know, we have a team here that will look after turning your mics off and on for anyone in the room, so you don't have to touch anything. Just wait till the red light comes on, and then you're good to start talking.
Okay. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I am Andrea Sandmeyer. This September, I had the honour of being the first person elected as the President of the Métis Nation of Alberta under our new Constitution, the Otipemisiwak Métis Government Constitution. Otipemisiwak is the Cree name for the Métis people. It means the people who own themselves, the people who govern themselves. No sentiment could better capture the spirit of Bill C-53. It is a bill to recognize who we are as self-governing people. In September, MNA citizens elected new representatives under our new governance structure and constitution. We did this because we are a self-governing nation, and our signed agreements with the Government of Canada recognize that. Bill C-53 implements our agreements and protects them. It ensures our Métis governments are equipped to support our citizens. Self-government means that we decide for ourselves how to best support Métis in Alberta. We decide what our housing and health programs look like. We decide how to help prepare our young people with world-class education and training. We decide how to support our elders as they age. And we decide how to move forward together. Only through self-government will the voices of Métis people truly be heard. This is why Bill C-53 must be passed. Our Métis ancestors were determined to govern themselves and protect our traditions, values, and truth for generations to come. They fought back against Canadian expansionism and the fraudulent scrip system that dispossessed our families and communities of our lands. And they defended Métis identity, lands, our way of life, and our rights. Over generations, the Crown made promises to our ancestors. But those promises were quickly broken, and our rights were denied and ignored. Nevertheless, we persevered. We came together, held democratic elections, and built our self-government structures. Today, the Métis Nation of Alberta is a democratic Métis government that represents more than 61,000 registered citizens. We continue to come together to defend Métis rights and to advance our collective interests. And we have built a province-wide service delivery system to help meet the needs of our people. Yet, we have always struggled to have Canada recognize us for what we are, a Métis government. Passing this legislation will provide that recognition. It is reconciliation in action. This historic step forward is long overdue. Our Section 35 rights as Indigenous people are not a zero-sum game. The advancement of self-government and Section 35 rights of one nation does not come at the expense of any other Indigenous nation, and more importantly, the legislation expressly applies only to the MNA, MNO, and MNS. The legislation does not impact the rights of other Indigenous people, including other Métis. We know that when one nation advances, it sets the path for all of us to move forward. Passage of C-53 doesn't affect anyone else, but failing to pass C-53 will hurt Métis people and the advancement of Indigenous rights across the board. This is true for the Métis Nation today. We deserve to advance in reconciliation just like all other Indigenous people. Over the past 15 years, Parliament has passed all other Indigenous self-government implementation legislation with all-party cooperation. It is our hope and expectation that Bill C-53 will follow the same path. I want to thank Minister Miller for bringing this legislation forward and his successor, Minister Ananda Sangari, for continuing this critical work and relationship. Last November, over 15,000 Métis citizens in Alberta voted for self-government, and we adopted our Otipemisiwak Métis Government Constitution in the largest Indigenous ratification vote in Canadian history. At that moment, a new chapter began for the Métis Nation of Alberta. And with this legislation, a new chapter begins for Métis across Canada. Together, we can finally put an end to Canada's denial of Métis as a self-governing Indigenous people. Today, we are asking for your support in passing Bill C-53. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much. We'll now go to Ms. Fro, and when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Bon après-midi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee members. My name is Margaret Fro, and I'm the democratically elected president of the Métis Nation of Ontario, or MNO. I will start by acknowledging that we're on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, and say that for over 2 centuries, Métis communities in what is now Ontario, along with other Métis communities through the Métis Nation homeland, have stood up and asserted our peoplehood, our distinct collective identities, and our rights as Métis. Within Ontario, Métis petitioned at Penetanguishene as early as the 1830s to have their rights and interests recognized. In 1849, Métis from the Sault Ste. Marie region joined with Anishinaabe to push back against Crown mining licenses being issued in their shared territories, leading to the well-known Mica Bay Uprising. In 1875, the half-breeds of Rainy Lake and Rainy River asserted their rights and ultimately entered into an adhesion to Treaty 3. Métis living in locations such as Nipigon to Moose Factory to Mattawa petitioned as well. And these Métis assertions were met with Crown indifference, denial, and neglect. But our people have always persevered. We did not go away or simply disappear. It has been now more than 40 years since Section 35 of the Constitution was established, recognizing and affirming the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Métis. For MNO, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Supreme Court's landmark Powley decision, which remains foundational for Métis rights assertions right across the Métis Nation homeland. And the Sault Ste. Marie Métis community continues to be the only Métis community in Canada to have their rights recognized by the Supreme Court. Bill C-53 is about more than Canada finally recognizing in law that the MNO is a Métis government and that the Métis communities represented by the MNO hold the inherent rights of self-government and self-determination. It's also about improving the lives of Métis children, Métis families and communities in Ontario and right across the Métis Nation homeland. The inherent rights that this legislation enshrines are human rights. However, because of Canada's historic denial of the very existence of the Métis people and our communities, we've seen our people fall through the cracks and not enjoy the same quality of life as other Canadians. Canada's denial and neglect has resulted in our history and communities not being as well known. Bill C-53 begins to reverse this colonial legacy of denial. It's the foundation needed for real and meaningful steps forward on the path to reconciliation, and it will have positive and tangible impacts on our communities, on our people. This includes the ability for Métis governments to finally have a say over what happens to Métis babies and children, and also to create our own systems to take care of our families, something Indigenous people across Canada have been pursuing for decades. We will finally be able to design programs and services that meet the actual needs of our citizens. Bill C-53 enables us to make those choices, not the Crown. I want to emphasize that Bill C-53 applies only to the MNO, the MNA, and the MNS. Bill C-53 does not impact the rights of other Indigenous peoples in any way, including Ontario First Nations. I want to acknowledge that there have been concerns raised by some First Nations about this legislation, and to reassure you that the MNO has been working hard to dispel the myths and the false information that's been spread about this bill. We ask this committee to ensure that it remains focused on what the bill actually does and says, not the myths or the rhetoric, the anti-Métis rhetoric being advanced by some. Similar to other Indigenous self-government legislation that Parliament has passed, Bill C-53 is only about matters that are internal to our Métis self-government, so that it's about our Métis citizenship. It's about Métis elections, Métis government internal operations, and Métis child and family services. It recognizes that no one other than our Métis citizens and communities should have a say over these internal self-government matters. Bill C-53 truly is reconciliation in action. It was co-developed with our governments and Canada, and it was introduced into Parliament with our full support. We do not seek any amendments or changes to the bill, and we ask that it be passed quickly by this committee, consistent with how other Indigenous self-government legislation has been considered. All we are asking is that Métis be respected and treated fairly and consistently by this committee, and that we be supported in our journey of self-determination and self-government. Reconciliation with all of Canada's Indigenous peoples is Parliament's goal. Now is the time for Parliament to take a clear step forward to achieve this goal, hand in hand with the Métis, and pass Bill C-53. Thank you. Merci. I welcome your questions.
Excellent. Thank you. And now, Ms. Leclerc, we'll go to you for your 5 minutes. The floor is yours when you're ready to start.
Thank you. Tansy, Atlanite, and good afternoon. I'm Michelle Leclerc. I am the Vice President and Minister of Justice for the Métis Nation, Saskatchewan. And I'm honored to be here today to talk to you about Bill C-53. As a Métis leader, I know I am indebted to leaders that have come before me, and some of you know them. The late Jim Sinclair and the late Harry Daniels, among many others. Some of my earliest memories are of those leaders fighting for the recognition of our rights. 41 years ago, Section 35 included Métis, First Nations, and Inuit people. And one of those people that fought for those rights was Harry Daniels. They fought for the rights, for the right of recognition of our rights, our right to self-determination, our right to self-government, our right to raise our children, and our right to thrive as a nation, Métis Nation, Saskatchewan. Generation after generation, our leaders have sacrificed everything to get to this point, and our government will work tirelessly to see this through. Our Section 35 rights must be honored and recognized. As representatives of Canada around the table, you don't grant us those rights. These rights are inherent rights, and they're given to us by the Creator and by those ancestors who fought, and many died, to ensure that we had those rights. And it's the duty of the Crown to recognize and uphold them. For more than 150 years of colonialism and oppression, our communities were divided and scattered, and still our people remained strong and united. This is what many fail to grasp about Bill C-53. The Métis, of course, according to the Canadian Constitution under Section 35, are one of the Indigenous peoples. These three peoples have rights, and they always have. There is no hierarchy in rights under Section 35. And rights and people, there's no hierarchies. You've got the First Nations, the Métis, and Inuit. We are all equal under the law. And Canada must recognize our rights and negotiate with each of us in good faith. This is your duty. Mine is to sit here and remind you of your duty. I also want to remind you that Section 35 is a full box of rights, and that it isn't up to other people to determine what those rights are. You don't get to pick our rights or choose rights that we get or other Aboriginal peoples get. These are inherent rights, and we all get the same recognition. We are all on the same footing. Legitimate rights holders should not be pitted up against one another. We would not tolerate it if it was attempted to do this with our First Nations and Inuit relations. All of you who represent Canada are bound to the honor of the Crown. It's your responsibility to build bridges, create opportunities for everyone to thrive, not to divide and conquer. To that end, we know First Nations in Ontario have voiced opposition to this legislation, and we acknowledge this. The MNS has consistently advocated for a process to defend the integrity of our nations. We have championed and advanced to all Métis Nation governments an independent panel that will look at the root issue. This expert panel is our way, the Métis way, to address this in a responsible, transparent, and objective way. And I'm confident that the expert panel will shed some light on the concerns that Ontario First Nations have. And I'm hoping that the Chiefs of Ontario will attend and become part of that process and express their concerns at that panel. I also encourage Ontario First Nations to raise these issues with Canada during the treaty consultation process. All three treaties, MNA, MNO, MNS, will be negotiated independently. And it's there, through that process, that duty to consult will be triggered. And MNS is committed to ensuring all impacted parties are consulted. When we're negotiating our treaty, we assume that MNO and MNA will do the same. The treaty process is Canada's venue to hear these concerns. Ours is in our expert panel, and I encourage Ontario First Nations to utilize both fully. But the venue for these concerns is not here, not regarding Bill C-53. Our legislation doesn't trigger the duty to consult. It lays the path to treaty making and for Canada to finally recognize what we have always known. We have and will never stop defending our rights generation after generation. In this moment, I feel within me all the lessons that I've learned and every blood memory passed down to me from each of those leaders that I talked about earlier. And they prepared us for this moment. And I promise them and our people that I will never stop until our rights are recognized. Bill C-53 is your chance to build a lasting relationship, nation-to-nation relationship with Métis Nation Saskatchewan. We're ready for this. The question is, are you?
Great. Thank you for each of you for your opening statements. And now we're going to get into the discussion. A couple of things I'd like to mention. Again, it's the same thing. I'll keep track of time, give when there's 30 seconds left and when time's up, so we can move to the next round of questions. Ms. Idlout is able to speak in her home language, and so when it's Ms. Idlout's turn, have your translation available if you need it. And it's something that we are really proud of that we're able to do. And when we have Indigenous witnesses, if we can accommodate any other languages, we try to do that as well. So really proud of the work that this committee is doing on that front. I would now like to start with Mr. Vidal, who has the floor for 6 minutes.
Actually, Mr. Schmiel.
Okay, Mr. Schmiel. We'll go with Mr. Schmiel. When you're ready, I'll start the clock.
Thank you very much, Chair. That's okay. I've been called worse.
Not much.
Thank you very much for our witnesses for appearing today and those in the audience here. This is a very important topic. I think this is something that we can all look back in the history books, that we were in this place when these discussions were happening and the conversations around this piece of legislation. Maybe I'll start first with the last comment made by Ms. Leclerc, President Leclerc, I should say, Vice President Leclerc, sorry, around that piece of consultation that you just said. As you said, you're doing self-government. This piece of legislation focuses in on Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Alberta only, so it doesn't quite trigger that part of consultation. The second part, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, does, and that part focuses around the treaty. Now, just to get clarification, and it doesn't matter who answers, just to get clarification, when the treaty part happens at some point, which will then trigger the consultation, does it have to come back to Parliament for ratification, or would it be a governor and council sign off? It's something I kind of want to get confirmation on, because we are getting conflicting reports.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank the chair and the honourable member for the question. And I would agree with you completely. This is a historic day, and so we're happy to be here. In terms of the treaty, at the point where we're negotiating treaty, as Vice President Leclerc was saying, if there's anything in that treaty that would impact on the rights of any other Indigenous peoples, the duty to consult and accommodate would be triggered, and Canada would be held to that standard, and we would expect Canada to stand to that standard. The Bill C-53 is not the treaty, and I think that's an important piece to say. That, and when we're focusing on Bill C-53, we're talking about what's before us today. It's the legislative cradle for future agreements, including the future treaty. I think your question around exactly what the process would be in terms of treaty and how that's moves through the federal process is probably best addressed to the minister, who would be able to give you the proper response on that. But I would just come back to the fact that the C-53 itself is not a treaty. It speaks to a future treaty, and it will become the cradle for that treaty when it comes. And again, it focuses on those matters that are internal to our three Métis governments: our citizenship, how we elect our leaders, how we govern ourselves, how we take care of our children. And as such, there is no duty to consult.
Okay, just in the order, so I don't leave anyone out, is there anyone else that wants to respond to that? We will definitely ask the minister and departmental officials on this, but just to clarify, if this legislation passes, say no amendments, just for saying, and then the treaty process happens, however long that takes, the consultations, is it anyone else's understanding that we would need parliamentary approval to then approve or reject any treaty that comes after that? Because we are getting reports from organizations saying no, but I just want to hear clarification if anyone has it here. But again, we'll ask the department officials when they come in too. Everyone else? Okay, we will follow up with the departmental officials then. Maybe President Fro, maybe I jump to you. There was some concerns, and I'm sure you know about them. You've been reading the same news we have as well, from the Ontario Chiefs and the issue around membership. They've raised a few concerns about membership, and specifically with the rate or the way some memberships are being approved, if you will, because as you know, the Indian Act gives the government control over who belongs to a First Native status, I guess, but it's the Métis organizations that do approve their own members. And there was some criticism around how you deal with your membership. Maybe you want to address that so we can flush that out.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And I'm sure my colleagues may want to jump in on this as well. So the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Métis Nation Saskatchewan and Métis Nation of Alberta, we all follow a national definition. We each have very strong registries, and the process to apply for citizenship is a very rigorous process. And we take that very, very seriously. In fact, so much so in Ontario, recently our Citizens in Assembly, after a multi-year independent review of our registry, determining that there were some 5,000 citizenship files that over the course of the last 30 years, perhaps before we had a national definition, before we actually had resources for our registry, people achieved citizenship without meeting the criteria. We've actually resolved to remove those 5,000 citizens. That's how seriously we take the issue of citizenship. We don't have buses that roam around the province. That's another piece of information that some have thrown out there. We have a very rigorous registry process, a very professional registry, and we determine. And I think that's the important part of Bill C-53. It's that Indigenous people have the right. This is part of UNDRIP as well, right? The UN Declaration. Indigenous peoples have the right to decide who belongs. Bill C-53 respects our Métis government's right to determine citizenship, and we do that through a rigorous process.
7 seconds? Okay. I'll save the rest for... Mr. Leclerc wants to respond. So.
If you don't mind. Thanks for the question, Jamie. Just as Margaret has talked about, our citizenship and our registry are transparent. As she said, she used the word rigorous. And it's our right to, and that's part of what this bill is about. It's our right to determine our membership. But on those questions that Ontario First Nations might have, I think it's an important point that, number one, we have this expert panel that is already active. They have an opportunity to bring that to us at the Métis National Council and express their concerns about whatever it is, whether it's citizenship or whether they think that there's going to be land, that there's some infringement on all of that. We would love to hear what their concerns are, because there hasn't been, talking back and forth for whatever reason. Bring those concerns there. In the Métis way, we will deal with that.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in. We're about a minute over, and we have lots of time. There may be a chance to come back to this. Sure, if you could conclude so we can move on to the next question.
And the other point that I would make is we're in a legislative process. We're not in treaty making right now. We do not, at this time, there's not a trigger on duty to consult. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, and I apologize for cutting off.
No worries.
I just need to keep the conversation going. We're going to go now to Mr. McLeod, who's on. Mr. Batiste. I on my list, Mr. Mr. Batiste. Okay, we're going to Mr. Batiste first.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chair, and I'd also like to acknowledge all of the Métis leaders that are gathered in this room for this historic day, who are here sharing this day with you. Just in terms of, I know that we've celebrated now in September 20 years since the Powley decision. I'm wondering if you could share for this committee what Powley stated, what was Powley about, as well as how did Powley case define who was Métis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Honourable Member, for the question. So yes, it is 20 years since we brought forward Powley. Powley was actually part of the entire Métis Nation. All of our governments were defending our citizens in the courts to try and get a case to go all the way to the Supreme Court so we could finally get a decision on the issue of Métis rights. That decision was Powley, and on September 19th, we marked the 20th anniversary. All of our Métis governments right across the Métis Nation were united on this. We brought it forward together. And in advance of going to the court, the Métis Nation actually determined a national definition. The Supreme Court, and we said to the Supreme Court, that's up to the nation to decide, not the court, stay out of that. what the court did do is to say, yes, there is a Métis community in Sault Ste. Marie. It does have rights, and it set out a test to prove Métis rights. That is still the test in Canada today. In fact, Sault Ste. Marie remains the only, as I said earlier, the only Métis community that's recognized by the Supreme Court with Section 35 rights. But effectively, what it did is to say, in order to have Métis rights, you need to be you need to identify as a Métis person as distinct from other Indigenous peoples. You need to show distinct Métis ancestry, and you need to show that Métis ancestry within historic Métis communities. Right? Because Métis rights are collective rights. They're all about those historic communities. And so there is, finally coming out of Paoli, there was that clarity. And that's been the foundation that's been used to negotiate harvesting rights in Manitoba and in Alberta. It's been the foundation for Métis rights cases right across the Métis Nation homeland. So it provides clarity.
Thank you for that. And would you say that all three of the MNS, MNA, MNO, their definitions of who is a Métis is consistent with Paoli?
Absolutely. So yes, thank you. Absolutely. All of our registries, the criteria that we apply are consistent with Paoli, and as such, our Métis governments represent, as per the Constitution, rights-bearing Métis people within our respective jurisdictions.
Thank you for that. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, this is the first step for Métis. I was listening to the discussion yesterday, the ceremony for the Saskatchewan Métis, and you said this is a historic starting place, and we have a lot more to do as a government to get to fulfillment of Métis rights. But my understanding of C-53 is this is all about internal governance that's for the Métis, and nowhere does it mention land or resources, and nowhere in C-53 does it recognize that any parts of lands or resources would be in jeopardy or trigger a duty to consult. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It really is talking about our own right to govern ourselves, the right to take care of our kids and our families. Just as a side, we have so many Métis kids that are lost in the system that, age out of that system and have no idea who they are, where their communities are, and so on and so forth. These are really, really important, but governance sort of issues. It doesn't touch issues of land, of, any kind of ceremonial rights or any of those kinds of things. It's really the starting point of being able, we are self-governing people, as I said before. It's the acknowledgement by the federal government to do, it's doing the right thing. Acknowledge that we have that right through legislation, and it affects literally no one other than our communities and our people.
Yeah, and I'll add to that and say that, again, the legislation does not talk about resources. It does not talk about land. It is about us. It's about our governance structure, our citizenship, our operations, and our children, as Vice President Leclerc said, which is very, very important to all of us. So it does not at all talk about resources or land.
Some of the concerns that have been raised is that there's no number of how many people are currently registered under the MNA, MNO, and MNS. Do you guys keep a registry, and what is that registry number at?
The Métis Nation of Alberta, we have over 61,000 citizens registered.
For the Métis Nation of Ontario, we all have very professional registries. We have, within the next 2 weeks, it'll be approximately 27,000 registered citizens. Currently, it's around the 32,000 mark.
Thanks for the question. We have around 30,000 registered Métis citizens in Saskatchewan.
Is there any reason to believe that C-53 will create a ballooning or a huge expansion of those numbers? Some of the fears are that it could be as much as 500,000 to 1 million people all of a sudden signing up. Is there any legitimacy to those arguments?
I don't see that happening. When we look at, for example, if you look to Stats Canada, people self-declaring in Saskatchewan, there is about 80,000 people who have self-declared.
Michelle, can I get a yes or no? Because I have run out of time.
No.
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 And I would agree as well.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go now to Madame Gill, who will have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci également.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. I know giving you 2 minutes each to answer isn't enough, but I'll try to ensure you get at least that. It's going to be a difficult question. I'm going to play devil's advocate. Ms. Faux, for example, you have spoken, I think, for all in mentioning disinformation, rhetoric, myths that we need to deconstruct. I'm using your own wording there, I think. I'd like to hear each of you on this. This is your space, if you wish. You've mentioned basic inherent rights, fine. But you know that there are people who disagree with adopting this bill. So what would you say about disinformation, myths, rhetoric? What more would you say about that? Perhaps, Ms. Sandmeyer, you'd like to begin, then over to Ms. Froh and Ms. Leclerc, Vice President Leclerc and presidents.
That something that we've said over and over, and in all of our opening remarks, that Bill C-53 is about us. It's about Métis Nation of Ontario, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, Métis Nation of Alberta. It is about our governance structure. It is about our citizenship, our electoral process, and our children. It is about no one else but us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, and again, I would reiterate, there's been a lot of rhetoric, there's been a lot of misinformation, and I think just from the very basic point around the denial of Métis communities existing, that is a fact within this country. It's a fact certainly within Ontario, and in fact, that's the law within Canada. So to simply make a statement that Métis communities don't exist, or some of the misinformation around, for example, the impact of this, when clearly it is only focused on our internal governance. There is no impact on any other people. That's the type of misinformation, and there's many examples of that. But I think it's important to come back to just how important Bill C-53 is. It's something that we've been waiting for over 200 years. We've been fighting for that recognition of rights. We've secured that, and in fact, 20 years ago, we secured that, and yet here we are again, having to debate with people the question of whether or not we even exist, let alone if we have rights. We don't want to go backwards. We are looking forward, and particularly we're looking forward to the future for our children.
I guess I would echo what both of my colleagues have said. I think when bills come forward, you're always going to hear some maybe misinformation and that sort of thing. The fact of the matter is that Métis people have inherent rights to and self-determination, to govern ourselves, to take care of our children. We're not asking to take care of other people's children. We're asking to be able to, and we have those rights. As I said earlier, those rights don't come from here, and they don't come from out there. They come from the Creator and the people who have fought, and many died for us to get us to this point, and we have to remember that. The other important point that we have to remember always is we are one of the 3 Indigenous people in the Canadian Constitution. That is our law. And to be able to say, well, you know what? I like the First Nations. I think I'll deal with them in good faith. The Inuit, same thing. But what about the Métis? Where is the good faith and where is the honor of the Crown when we're listening to all of this stuff happen? And I believe that everybody has the right to speak and to, free speech, the right to demonstrate, all of that. But at the end of the day, as we sit here and we look at that legislation, and I know you've all looked at it, it doesn't affect their rights, anybody's rights, but our own.
Oui, bien sûr.
Yes, indeed.
In our comments that this is reconciliation in action. My late elder, Francis Dumais, did not. The word reconciliation for him, he was a Cree speaker, and there was no word in Cree for reconciliation. He always talked about setting things straight. It's time for the government to set things straight. And it is. It is time for the government to set things straight. Sadly, we lost him last year, and he was a leader in the Métis Nation of Alberta. He was a mentor, he was an elder, and he was a friend. And I wish that he could be here today, but I know that he's watching. I know he's watching. Thank you.
Je peux les reprendre plus tard, Monsieur le Président.
I could get back to those other issues later, Chair. Thank you. Thank you.
I should clarify as well that as we go through the questions, each of the members will generally control where they're directing their questions. And so if you want to jump in, feel free to raise your hand, but get the member's question. I tend to let the members decide where they're directing their questions. But if you have something to say or build on, just let the member asking the questions know that you're ready to weigh in there. If they choose to go on to another line of questioning, we start getting into some pretty tight time frames, and they may it picks up after this. So it is the member's choice, though, where they're going to direct the questions. Now, without any further delay, Ms. Idlut, we'll go to you for your 6 minutes.
Qayanami exivatari amaru qayanami ilun nasi akswaru dusang noktuin lusi ukadlakasi piyunaw tilirigatta.
Lori, sorry, just a second. We're not getting the translation, so I'm going to restart your time. And
I'm sorry. Testing. Okay. Yes. First of all, I want to thank every one of you. What I'm hearing is very good. And I am speaking to you now from my home community of Iqaluit. I am glad to hear what you're speaking of, because we are speaking to our rights as a people, as Métis, Cree, and Inuit. But right now, the focus is on the Métis rights as a nation. Bill C. If Bill C-53 is not passed, how would it affect your nation? To you yourselves, your children, and your grandchildren. If you all want to respond to this letter, to this question, then I leave it to you to respond. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to respond. Hello. Thank you for the question, honourable member. So Bill C-53 is Indigenous recognition legislation. It is the same type of legislation that comes with every Indigenous self-government agreement, every modern treaty in this country's history. And it's the tools that it provides the tools for Canada that it needs to change its laws to recognize Indigenous governments. So, each of our Métis governments have signed 2 now self-government agreements. We made history in doing that. And we require this legislation in order for Canada to change its laws to provide that recognition. If Bill C-53 is not passed, not only would that mark the first time ever in this country's history that Parliament has not supported Indigenous self-government, it would also leave us in a bit of a limbo in that we have written agreements with government recognizing our inherent rights without the legislation to provide the support for that recognition. I think that could create many, many different types of problems for Parliament, for government, and it'll certainly create problems for our governments as well. But I think more importantly, really what it would do is send a signal to the Métis in this country that we are not respected. And that, I believe, is the very opposite of the intent of reconciliation. And so I would thank the member for the question, and just say, we're looking forward to this opportunity to talk to the committee, to go through the legislative process, and to see Bill C-53 become law, and finally to see that recognition of Métis self-government in this country.
I can also just add to that. Thank you for the question, Lori. Well, we have been self-governing people for hundreds of years. We have fought and fought and fought. From Louis Riel losing his life, my own uncle dying on the last day of the Battle of Batoche. Our people have gone through a lot. And when we talk about scattered communities, in Saskatchewan, to get families off road allowance, they decided they had this scheme where they could send them up north to a particular community of Green Lake. And as those people got into the trains, their villages and their communities were burned, and they watched that happen. This is not something that all of a sudden we're fighting for. This is something that we've been fighting for since the Battle of Seven Oaks in the early 1800s. And we have again and again and again been left out. And we've been treated like the poor cousins of somebody. And so how does it affect our children and our grandchildren? It affects them in the same way as it has affected us, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and the way that they were treated. And it doesn't speak to the intent of what Section 35 is supposed to do, and Section 25. Without passing this bill, and this is the beginning of a bill, this is just talking about governing ourselves and moving to where we need to get to treaty. If we can't pass this bill, then we're not respecting the Canadian Constitution. We're picking and choosing which nations Canada wants to deal with. And we're saying to Métis people, oh, I'm sorry, you're not quite as important as somebody else. That's not right. I hope when we talk about reconciliation, I just testified at an APA meeting on Section 29, or Bill C-29, on reconciliation. This is reconciliation in action. And not only does it deal with reconciliation, it deals with the UNDRIP. It deals with constitutional obligations that Canada have to us. And if this bill failed, I believe it would be a tremendous black mark on this beautiful country we call Canada. You can't pick and choose.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of that 6-minute round. Next, we have 2 5-minute questions, followed by 2 2.5, and then 2 5. So, Mr. Vidal, you're going next. Okay, so the floor is yours when you're ready to go.
Thank you, Chair. I too want to thank all of you for being here today. I know this has been a long journey, and I'm going to say it as well, and I know it's been said already, but I'm going to say it again, that this is a very significant and defining moment for both Métis people across our country and our country in general. And I think we need to get this right. And I think having the honest, and sometimes what I call in my interactions with people is sometimes we have to have adult conversations, which means sometimes we have difficult conversations to get through the journey together. And so, that's maybe part of the process that we're going to go through today. I've got about 7 different directions I want to go here, so I'm going to try to focus on a couple in the next 4 minutes here. But just for clarity, I want to go back to the comment that my colleague, Mr. Schmale, made or asked about Parliament not having to pass legislation to enact the treaties later. And we do have a legislative summary from our very capable Library of Parliament analysts that have very clearly told us that Parliament will not need to pass additional legislation to implement future treaties or supplementary self-government agreements with listed Métis governments. Rather, than any such agreements will be brought into force by a governor in council. So that seems pretty clear to me. So unless the analysts have some other reason to clarify that for me, which I'm assuming they don't. So where I want to go with this quickly is the timing of all of this. We go back, I mean, this all started way back in, 2018 with MOUs, and then there was agreements in 2019, an updated agreement in February of 2023. I think for each of you, they're all unique agreements. So with all of that long preamble, let me simply ask each of you, what's next? If this legislation is passed, each of you are going to enter into a process. That will be an independent process, if I understand it right. But I also understand that there's some very clear next steps and some time frames, which include a window of about 2 years starting from when you signed those agreements. So can you clarify for everybody in this room, each of you, what's next if this legislation gets passed?
Happy to start. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, it did start back in 2017, and we've been building on that ever since. What's next for us, as you've referenced in our agreements, we've actually, all three of our Métis governments have committed with Canada to enter into negotiations of a modern self-government treaty. So taking this jurisdiction that's been recognized around how we self-govern, how we govern ourselves, and taking that into treaty form. So that's definitely a part of the work that we'll be undertaking with Canada. And then, of course, each of our respective governments are busy implementing our self-government agreements, and we're in various stages of that. But we're all on that same path towards that full recognition of self-government. So for the Métis Nation of Ontario, we're beginning a constitution-building process, and I'll let my colleagues speak to where they are. But yes, there's a great more deal work to do. And then on top of that, we have to deal with the day-to-day providing services to our people, and in particular, the taking care of our children piece is a massive part of the work that we have ahead of us.
So for the Métis Nation of Alberta, as stated in my opening remarks, we had a ratification vote last November of our Constitution. So that was one step. And then in September 19th of 2023, we had our first election under our new Otipemisiwak Métis government, which now goes from 6 regions to 22 districts and 25 people, including a women's representative and a youth representative, and myself sitting on a citizens' council. So we have a lot of work to do there, as you can imagine. And, of course, our treaty negotiations. So we've done a lot, and we still have a lot more to do.
Okay. Sure, just really quickly, because we're doing a lot of the similar things that Alberta and Ontario are doing. We are in constitutional reform, making sure that we have our governance structures that work for our people. So we've been going through that process. We are working on a judiciary which deals with issues that happen within our government, even around child and family services. And so there's been a lot of work done there. But in the meantime, negotiating that treaty is very important, and trying to stay within that window of 2 years. And at the same time, consulting with our First Nations communities in Saskatchewan, which we do anyway, but we'll continue to do that to make sure that we're not in any way sort of infringing on their rights. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a story. We're just really quickly, John, sorry. We're doing...
Keep getting my red card, but yeah, just very quickly, and then
just
we'll go
really
to the
quick.
next question.
We're doing Bill C 92 consultations in our community, which deals with all throughout Saskatchewan, which deals with the safety of children and jurisdiction and that sort of thing. what's been really great about that whole process is that we've been able to work with our sisters and brothers from First Nations communities to make sure that when we're dealing with families and children, we're doing it right. And so I just wanted to make that point after the red card.
Thanks, Michelle. We're going to go now to Mr. McLeod, and he's joining us online. Mr. McLeod, when you're ready, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the presenters here today. I really appreciate your presentation. Very interesting information. As a Métis person from the Northwest Territories, I totally understand the work and effort that has taken place over the years. I think my committee colleagues are tired of me saying it, but I've been involved in a land claim since the 1970s, and we still haven't finished our framework agreement. So it's a long process, but I think we're also all connected. My first language was Michif. I'm a descendant of people that were fighting in the Riel Rebellion and went north to avoid prosecution. So in some ways, I think we're all connected, and the fighting over during the Riel Rebellion caused people to split all over the country. But I can tell you, in the Northwest Territories, we have, in our case, we have a joint land claim. It's First Nations and Métis together, because we share a lot of common, many things we're all related, and we speak the same languages for the most part. We share hunting areas, and when it comes to negotiating a land claim, though, the status First Nations can pull out a list, a band council list, and that's well documented. Everything's there, birth dates, where all the information's been compiled for years. But on our side, on the Métis side, we don't have a list like that. And so we have to take the list that we have compiled, and the government decides or together, I guess we decide on the criteria. And then there's an enumeration process. Now, that process could take a long time. In some cases, the NWT Métis, for example, they've been negotiating and doing the enumeration ongoing since the 1990s. And they figure at the rate they're going, it's going to be another 10 years. And they certainly don't have the numbers that you guys have. So I'm expecting that this is what you're going to be seeing. I don't know if everybody's on the same page when it comes down to your membership, though. I want you to just tell me quickly, maybe just one of you that could confirm there is a confirmation that there is a test for every one of your members, and there will be a process at some point for enumeration.
Yeah, well, I thank you very much for the question. It's good to see you. So, yes, there is, as I was mentioning earlier, each of our Métis governments, we have well-established registries. There is very clear criteria for applying for citizenship. There's a very rigorous process that is involved for that. And every citizen making an application for citizenship has to meet those criteria in order to be recognized and admitted as citizens. And so in terms of enumeration, I think in that sense, I think we're in a very good place in terms of we already have those well-established registries that are in hand. And I think in many respects, it's a little bit of a different process than what you're seeing in the Northwest Territories. But again, this comes back to Bill C-53 and just how important it is to have that legislative framework for that recognition of the registries that we do have and our inherent jurisdiction around citizenship. So thank you for the question. Marcy?
Yeah. I want to thank you for that. And I felt I had to ask you to clarify it, even though the questions was posed before, because I think that's something that's, as soon as we talk about this bill, that keeps coming up as almost with everybody, because they're saying, oh, geez, these organizations are just opening the door. Anybody can walk in. I'm hoping, though, and I'm not sure if you're at a point where you can talk to this detail, but equality or parity is something that we're really striving to get as an Indigenous population in the Northwest Territories. Our goal is to have parity on all programs and services at some point. We want to be able to have the same access to health care and education and employment, housing, social services. The list goes on. The same as First Nations people. Now, I know that that's plaguing a lot of Métis people now, because if you're Métis and you have a child that's born with autism, you can't get support from Jordan's Principle or programs of that nature. Is that something that is maybe is your goal, or is that something that you're experiencing already that you'd like to see changed?
Yeah,
I'll say we're at the end of the time, but if somebody could answer this question briefly, and it may be something that can be picked up.
Yeah,
for
it won't
further
be
round of
long.
questions.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Michael. Yeah, I mean, those are the things that we need to do. Our communities, we talk about the 60 scoop, and we talk about, all of those things. But when we look at what's happening in our province of Saskatchewan, for example, it's a new kind of scoop, right? There's not the support that kids need, and kids are getting taken away from their homes, sometimes for not very good reasons. One of the reasons sometimes that a child is taken away is mom can't afford to deal with the disability that the child's having. And so for all of you, you probably know, Métis people cannot apply for Jordan's Principle. I believe the Inuit can, but Métis people can't. So you can literally, Michael, have a family where you've got, mom has 2 kids. One's Métis and one's First Nations. They're not treated equally. There needs to be equal treatment of these Indigenous kids. And it, again, goes back to Section 35. I mean, come on. Our rights are equal rights, and Métis people and Métis children are not treated in the same way as other Indigenous people. And these are the things that we need to work towards in a good way.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to move next to Madame Gill. And just to warn our witnesses, the next 2 rounds go very fast, 2.5 minutes. So everybody needs to be pretty tight with the comments. Madame Gill, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. As one of my colleagues earlier said, of course, these are difficult questions. You have touched on some of the myths a little earlier. I would like to point you to a myth that's probably linked to what Mr. McLeod just mentioned about membership. He mentioned the concern that some have that a great number of new members would suddenly declare themselves. And then you do also have people who are self-identifying as being Métis, but don't recognize themselves as such and do not recognize Métis government structures, and are excluded from their own nation in a certain way of thinking because they don't really recognize their nation. So I'd like to know how, because of course we're mentioning inclusion, not scattering, how, of course we're not discussing treaties here, but how Section 35 might somehow provide a framework within which to respond to their concerns. Whoever wishes to respond.
I'm happy to take a start. Thank you. Merci for the question. I think that's very important about Bill C-53. It is very clear. It only applies to our 3 Métis governments. It only applies to those individuals, those citizens that choose to be citizens of our 3 Métis government. And so I think that is the answer to the question. Any individual can choose or not to be a citizen of one of our 3 Métis governments. This legislation will only impact those that do.
j'aurais une question peut-être. Donc, ça voudrait dire...
All right, so I have a follow-up question. That would mean that someone who does self-identify as a Métis citizen might not be recognized as being a citizen because they would choose not to adhere to the structure that you would set up. I'm not sure how else to put this because I just want to say it as neutrally as possible. So you'll have someone who is a Métis, let's say, deliberately chooses not to be a member of the group and would no longer be a Métis, no longer be called a Métis or be allowed to be a Métis because they would have turned down the right to become a Métis and true, within your structure. Is that the state of matters?
Thank you for that question. And it's an interesting question. We have, I'll give you an example. We have in Canada a number of non-status Indians that could maybe get status on a reserve in Ontario, or they choose not to. And they don't like the system and the process, but that's their choice. And that, it comes back to really talking about rights and individual rights when we're talking about UNDRIP and the right to decide who you belong to and what organization. And I wanted to go back to something else that we were talking about before. And I understand that, and I think that's a question that we have to internalize and talk and think about. How do we want our members to come on in, feel comfortable, be good providing citizens and all of that? But I think there was a question I think Michael had got to, which I'm going to answer really quickly, and that was...
Michelle, sorry, I want to go back to Michael's. He'll have a chance to come forward, but we're out of time for Madame Gill's question, and don't lose track of that thought. You may be able to weave it in here, I know. But Ms. Edlut is patiently waiting for her round, and I want to make sure that she gets her time. So, Ms. Edlut, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question to President Sandamaya. Now, in consideration, in considering the Métis settlements in Alberta, would MNA be willing to work with the Métis settlements to ensure that their concerns are addressed in a cooperative manner?
Yes. Over the period of time where we were doing consultation on our constitution, we did send numerous letters to the Métis Settlement General Council. We have citizens, Métis Nation of Alberta citizens, that live on those settlements. So we very much wanted them to be involved in the process of the consultation on our constitution. Now, more recently, probably about a week ago, we did have myself and my new Secretary of Métis Settlement and First Nation Relations, Karen Collins. Her and I met last week with the President and Vice President of Métis Settlement General Council, and we are we're very pleased with how that meeting went, and we look forward to building a stronger relationship with the settlements. And yeah, we want to be able to have our citizens within the settlement be a part of what we are doing here.
Going back to my first question. My first question was answered. Now I'm going to ask you again, if Bill C-53 failed to get passed, how would it affect your nations?
Mr. Chair, can I?
I just wanted to pose that question to Andrea because she didn't have a chance to respond.
give you a chance to respond, and then I'll go to the next question.
Thank you, member. Well, failing to pass C-53 will hurt all Métis people and the advancement of all Indigenous people in Canada. So, yeah, it will affect all of us. It's there. That legislation is there to protect us, to protect our rights. Governments come and go, and we need that legislation to protect what we've built.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go next to Mr. Schmale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again, witnesses. I'll go a little faster this time because I only have 5 minutes. I have so much to talk about. Congratulations, President Sandmeyer, on your recent election, and to former President Patras. It was great working with you. Maybe I'll start with you, if I could. What an exciting time to be up in President. I want to bring to the attention of some of the correspondence we received from the Métis in Fort McKay, also the Métis settlements of Alberta, their concerns about kind of elevating MNA over their groups where they have elected bodies to look after their people. Maybe you could briefly explain or maybe address some of the concerns where they wouldn't necessarily belong to MNA, but have fears that MNA would then be governing over them or having responsibility over child welfare, etc.
Again, the Bill C-53 is about the Métis Nation of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario. It's about the citizens that have chosen to be citizens of the Métis Nation of Alberta. We have citizens that live on those settlements. We have citizens that live in Fort McKay. We have citizens that live in Pincher Creek, in Fort Vermilion. We have 61,000 citizens in Alberta. But it's their choice if they want to be and a part of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And that's it's explicitly says that in the legislation.
You probably are aware that they are asking for amendments to ensure that they would then, the Fort McKay and the Métis settlements, among others, would want specific amendments to basically carve out, if you will, a section ensuring that they are, in fact, I know, as you said, have that option, but are, in fact, the representatives of the people who elected them to be that way. Would you be open to that amendment, or do you have comments to address that?
Yeah, again, I think that in the legislation and in our self-government agreements, it does specifically say that it's Métis citizens of Alberta, those that have chosen to become Métis citizens. And if they're not Métis citizens, they've not chosen to be Métis citizens, then they're not included in that legislation.
Michelle, quickly, sorry, Vice President.
That's okay, you can call me Michelle. I guess I would answer that in this way, that if the legislation, as Andrea is talking about, affects only their members, remember we've talked about verifiable systems to get membership. There's nothing stopping, in my view, Fort McKay as a community to say to the federal government, we want a self-government agreement. We're seeing it time and time again with First Nations now in our country. They're either A, not part of treaty, or B, don't want to live under the restrictions of the Indian Act. And we've seen them. One from our province. I believe there is negotiations going on with another band from our province. They're not related. They're not related people. They live in their own communities, their own settlements, and have done for a long time. There is nothing barring other Section 35 rights holders to negotiate a self-government agreement, which they're all doing, outside of our provinces or inside our provinces, for goodness sakes. Just because one band.
Vice President, I'm sorry, I have 45 seconds.
Okay,
I really have
okay,
a question I need to go to. I don't mean to cut you off, and I apologize, and I will apologize profusely. In the definition of treaty, when we talk about the next step treaty, it's not potentially not just about land, but when we're looking up the definition of the treaty, there is reference to modern treaties that are also called comprehensive land claims agreements. And that's something the Ontario Chiefs were kind of raising in their concerns about this piece of legislation. And that's why we're trying to flush out, I got 5 seconds, flush out the details on whether or not the treaty comes back to Parliament, how that works. Could you explain your stance on that? I'm sorry, I'm out of time.
I'll give one person a brief opportunity to respond to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you.
So the legislation does make reference to treaty, as do our self-government agreements. But for clarity, these are modern self-government treaties. So they'll take the rights that are being recognized in the legislation, which is our inherent rights to self-determination, to self-government, and those will be collected in the form of the treaty. They don't deal with lands.
Thank you. Mr. Carr, you're next, and you have 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to start by recognizing all the folks behind our witnesses. I don't know what we call this. In the House of Commons, we call it the gallery, so I guess this is the equivalent. But it's very nice to have folks here participating in our democratic process. I think it also keeps us on our game a little bit when we have more people in attendance, and that's a good thing. So welcome to everybody, and thanks for being here. There's been a lot of talk of history, and I apologize, I'm going to take a moment in the preamble, but I come from Manitoba. I represent a Winnipeg riding. And as we talk about history, I was at the Manitoba Métis Federation's annual General Assembly last week, where Premier Canoe announced that his government, a historic government, would be taking a historic action, which I know many of you are aware of, and that was to officially declare Louis Riel as the first Premier of Manitoba. And it was a proud moment for me to be there amongst Manitoba Métis and other citizens from Winnipeg and Manitoba and across the country in celebration of that and in honor of that. And it was nice to hear mention of Seven Oaks. I was an administrator, a high school principal in the Seven Oaks School Division in Winnipeg, and you don't typically hear Seven Oaks talked about outside of Winnipeg, but of course in the context of Métis history, it's quite important. I'm going to direct this question actually to Regional Councillor Case. I noted that he has not spoken yet, had a moment where the mic came off and then the mic was turned off, so I'm going to let him chime in. And if the question's not appropriately directed to you, feel free, Councillor, to put it elsewhere, but I wanted to make sure I could find my chance to include you. I'll ask the question. Or did you have something before I ask the question? No, okay. So the question was, and it piggybacks a little bit on some concerns that have been raised, but I hear sometimes, and perhaps it's hyperbole and fear-mongering, but you hear stories of organizations that claim to be Métis that aren't represented here, that are for a fee, allowing folks to register, giving them Métis cards that these individuals are then taking to universities, businesses, so that they can check a box that says, I have Indigenous status, and to meet some type of criteria that's been set in place. It would seem to me that broadly speaking, this is a fraudulent activity in many instances, particularly given that once this legislation is passed, this will not be groups that are officially recognized within this framework. Is there a role that the federal government can play in helping assist Métis governments in Canada alongside post-secondary institutions, businesses, or others to identify the proper rights holders and proper leadership of Métis governments and communities in order to make sure that they aren't falling victim to perhaps an attempted disguise and monetary benefit of something that isn't in fact correct. So, Councillor, I turn that to you.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you all for having us here. I think the easiest way to support that is to pass Bill C-53. The governments that are represented here at this table have established registries that uphold the national definition of Métis that was established by the Métis Nation through the Métis National Council and ratified by every single one of our governments when I was a kid. That decision was made. That definition was then upheld when my community was put on trial. We were put on trial. I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie while Canada and Ontario were using all of the resources of their justice departments to tell us we didn't exist. And quite frankly, we overcame that because we're pretty resilient, but also because the facts of history are on our side and they were not on Canada's side. And the facts of history and the law are on our side. And so work with us to support our governments to continue to expand the capacity of our registries to do that work, and then we can provide that support to those institutions that want to stamp out that disgusting thing that is happening in those institutions of people claiming something that's not theirs.
Thanks very much. I'll cede the rest of my time, Mr. Chair.
Oh, can I add?
There's 10 seconds left.
I cede it to Madame Leclerc.
Okay, thank you. I just want to really quickly say that this is not just a Métis problem. This is a First Nations, Métis, and Inuit problem. We're looking in the news now. You've got 2 girls who are claiming to be Inuit, actually benefited by getting money to go to university. But one of the ways that we're dealing with it in Saskatchewan is we have signed a number of agreements, one with the University of Saskatchewan. So they say, look, we have this person applying for a job. Can you verify that this is a Métis person? And I think we're working on agreements with other institutions as well as the government of Saskatchewan, because it has become a big problem. And these are creative ways that I think we can all deal with it. I know it happens here, it happens everywhere. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks for the 10 seconds.
Thank you so much. Colleagues and witnesses, just so you know, the next round that we have is about 25 minutes, which will take us about to 5:30. We've been going a little bit over, and so we have resources until 5:42, and so I'll see where we're at. I'll check in at 5:30, but if everybody's good for one more round, we'll go through that. And so first up for 5 minutes, I have Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I want to come back to Mr. Case. You just said a couple minutes ago in response to our colleague Mr. Carr that all of the governments at the table use the national definition of Métis. That's right. I want clarity because that's my understanding is that's not the case. In fact, I have a letter here written to President Fro from the President of Saskatchewan that's talking about the challenge that you've had historically over that national definition of Métis. And there's been some long history to that, if I understand the process. So I just want some clarity. And in fact, unless I'm mistaken, the Manitoba Métis Federation actually left the MNC over the dispute over the use of that national definition of Métis. So I want to come back to you and say, okay, I don't mean claimed as in I doubt you, but I just want clarity in the sense of the use of the national definition, please.
Yeah, I'll respond really quickly, Mr. Vidal, and then maybe Vice President Leclerc can respond for the M&S part. But in 2002, the Métis National Council adopted that definition, and at assembly the following assembly or assembly just after that, Métis Nation of Ontario, again, I was 11, so I can't, but Métis Nation of Ontario adopted that definition into our registry policy and have been implementing it ever since. There are questions from before that point, right? And as President Fro said, we dealt with that, and 5,000 citizens were removed because they didn't meet the national definition. Other people can say other things, but that's the truth.
Thank you. Okay, no, I'll follow that up. Vice President, do you want to comment at all on the President's letter that was pretty emphatic about that definition and the history of that? I want to give you the opportunity, but I do have another question for you, so don't go too long, okay?
Okay. I don't know that I can get into it because it was a letter sent to Métis Nation Ontario. I think the bigger issue, we all have the national definition which we follow. I think the bigger issue was those that didn't fit within that national definition, if I read that right. And Margaret has indicated to you that I think it was you guys had 5,000 members that didn't fit that definition and that are no longer part of their organization. We're all doing work to ensure that what we do is transparent. On that, we run our registry once a year against the INAC registry, so that if we have First Nations people who have applied, it will come up that they have applied, they've been accepted, and they're no longer a member of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan.
Thank you. I'm going to interject because I am seriously running out of time. I want to ask one more question before they kick me out of this place today. This has taken a long time to get here. In my office, we've monitored some Indigenous legislation over the last couple of years, and you talked about Bill C-29, introduced on the last day before the summer break. Bill C-38, which we finally debated last Friday, was introduced on the last day before last Christmas. 11 months later, we're actually debating it in the House of Commons, and Bill C-53 finally introduced on the last day before the summer break in June of 2022. This has taken a long time, and I think there was several promises and dates and expectations created by the government for your leaderships. I'm going to start with you, Michelle, because you keep getting cut off by being last, so I'm going to start with you. Do you want to comment at all on what you think took so long, or why it took so long, and why it took till the very last minute when I know this was promised several times in advance of that? Mm-hmm.
Well, I can only say that we have been frustrated. We've had dates. I think it was April 19th that was supposed to go in, and then apparently there was some things happening, and then finally we end up at the last day before you guys are recessed for the summer. I think we would be as interested to know the answer to that question as you are. And that question should be directed at Canada, because we have co-developed this. We've worked together in good faith, as of course we would. And so, no, we would love to hear the answers to that question.
I promise you when the minister's here, I will ask that question.
Okay.
Right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We're going to move to our next person now. I have Ms. Gainey online for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
You're good.
Thanks. And a thank you as well to the witnesses for your insight and the hard work that you all have clearly contributed to getting here today. I'm curious, we've heard UNDRIP come up a couple of times. Specifically, I think Clause 4 in the bill does state that one of the purposes is to contribute to the implementation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I'm wondering if you could, each of you, take a moment to kind of explain, in your view, how does this legislation contribute to the implementation of UNDRIP?
So as you've heard, I think all of us say, this Bill C-53 really is reconciliation in action. It is putting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into action. So I wanted to thank the honourable member for the question. Article 3 specifically talks about the Indigenous people's rights to self-determination. And, Bill C-50, I'll say Article 4 specifically talks about the right to have autonomy or self-government, right? Article 33 of the UN Declaration speaks to the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine our own identity, or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. And so what you see in Bill C-53 is exactly that. It's a recognition of those inherent rights of self-determination and self-government. In fact, it's built right into Canada's National Action Plan on implementing the UN Declaration. And as has been said before, I believe every time we see an Indigenous nation being recognized and being respected in this way, it actually makes all of us stronger. It makes Canada stronger. Merci for the question.
I don't think I can say any more than what President Fro has said. You know, we have over 200 years of history of being the forgotten people, of being promised things and a lot of broken promises. And the bill and UNDRIP recognizes that we have been forgotten about, the Métis people have forgotten about. And we just need you to move forward and get this bill passed so that we can govern ourselves the way that we have always believed that we have been doing. Thank you.
I really don't have anything to add. I think Margaret and Andrea have said what I would say.
John, do I have a time?
Yeah, there's still 2 minutes left.
Okay. So you've mentioned children and families. We touched a little bit on the complexities around the Jordan's principle. I'm wondering if you could be a little bit more specific about how this will really impact the health and well-being of your communities, especially children in a practical sense. Like, what are the problems, you know, that you see this really solving for the kids and for the families in your communities?
Okay, how long is this afternoon?
2 minutes.
I'll tell you, our communities are struggling. And so we are in the process of working outside of this with Bill C-92, which really is looking at what is happening to our communities. Why are the kids being taken? What kind of services do these kids have? You know, we've heard time and time again, and I'm sure everybody hears it across Canada, when you talk about mental health services for children. In Saskatchewan, you are on a 2-year waiting list to get your child in for any kind of an assessment. And so, you know, people languish and they, you know, kids end up in correctional systems or what have you, because we cannot give them the support that they really need at the times that they need it. And there's such a lack of programming. I mean, the provincial government isn't doing a great job of being local parentis, which means that the minister is their father. And it's ridiculous. And we know we don't need Canada or Saskatchewan to come into our communities and tell us what we're doing wrong. Because we know what's happening. And it's been systematically where they've been doing it wrong. And it's our time to take our kids back and to figure out our own way how to deal with this in our community.
Mr. Chair, can I point for members of the committee?
Yes, please.
There's a great,
just briefly.
There's a great op-ed piece in today's Hill Times from Teresa Stenlin, who's a regional councillor within our government, about a wonderful pilot that our Northwestern Ontario Métis community have established, the first ever Métis Child and Family Services Agency in the province, and I think it will be very helpful for members to consider that as they, just adding to what's already been said.
Thank you for raising that. Kate, we're going to go now, and sorry about the clock. I was resetting it to the 2.5 minute time. So, Madame Gill, it's over to you for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I will repeat that once again, I'm going to be asking a difficult question. I'm playing devil's advocate. Of course, we must be in a position to support the decisions that we will be making as parliamentarians. You've mentioned myths now, and among the First Nations, there are some that are openly saying that they do not want this bill adopted. So I'd like to hear your opinions on why you think this is the case. In Ontario, for example, I'm not sure if President Sandmeyer or President Fro or Vice President Leclerc would like to answer. And of course, you can send in your responses by writing. I should underscore that.
There are some that are saying they don't want the bill to go forward. They are saying, I understand that it's going to impact their rights. And I think, as you've heard already, this bill is about our internal self-government. It only impacts our three Métis governments. It only impacts our citizens. It has no impact on any other Indigenous people. But I wanted to come back to your last question, Honourable Member, because I think it's important just to come back to, I think what the question that you were asking was about an individual Métis and Section 35, and I think it's very important to point out that Section 35 rights are actually collectively held rights. So an individual can choose to become a citizen of a Métis government or not. It's actually the rights-bearing community that holds those rights. And that's exactly who it is that we represent, our three Métis governments. We represent rights-bearing Métis communities and people within our respective jurisdictions. That's what Section 35 is all about, and that's what Bill C-53 is all about in recognition of that, recognizing our inherent rights of self-determination.
And just quickly to add what Margaret's saying, is we are opening up the door. We have an expert panel. We would love to hear cogent arguments about what they see as this bill in any way impacting them or any of their rights, because we talk about what it does do, but I feel like when we're talking about this, we need to talk about what it doesn't do. It doesn't touch land. It doesn't talk about all of these other things. And I think there's that, you used it, the word myth. There's these myths or discussions out there that really have no bearing on what we're talking about today. And so, yeah, I think that answers that question.
Okay, that's the end of the 2.5 minutes. Ms. Idlout, we're ready to go to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't have really have a question, but I just want to state that this is very important. As I said earlier, we're talking about rights. You have rights. We have to work together as one. Inuit, the First Nations, and the Métis Nations. We have to stand together, all of us, as Indigenous people of Canada, and we have to support each other. I believe very strongly in that. Because in Canada, as us Indigenous people were rendered apart, the government attempted to render us apart and to change our culture, our cultures. But now the First Nations have said, no, we have our rights. And today, I thank you because you have made it so much clearer. And I believe that we are moving towards having equal rights as any other nations. Thank you. I just want to thank you very much for coming to speak here. Thank you.
But there's a minute left in Laurie's time. If anybody would like to make a comment, Ms. Sandmeyer, you didn't get to finish the last round, so I'll go to you if you'd like to take a bit of time here.
I just want to thank you, Honourable Member, for your statement. and just say, you know, we have heard the myths and the First Nations speak out against the bill. Recently, actually, right after I was elected, that same week, I went to a flag raising of a post-secondary school in Edmonton. And after the ceremony, their elder came up to me, their First Nations elder came to me and said, "Congratulations. Congratulations on your self-government legislation. We need to work together. We are all related. We have family that live that are First Nations. We have family that live on settlement. We all need to work together." I think a lot of what's been going on and being said is very political, but when you get to the grassroots and speak to people, there's a lot of different stories out there, a lot of positive stories, and a lot of congratulations from people that we're moving forward. And in turn, that moves them forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We have next for 5 minutes, Mr. Viersen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Interesting, wasn't something that I anticipated as much, was the issues around childcare. Now, I was here when this committee was dealing with C-92 back in 2019. Ms. LeClaire, can you just talk a little bit about how C-92 is or is not fulfilling those child welfare issues that your community is dealing with, and why you need this particular piece of legislation to do that?
Okay, so C-92 is really at its beginning. And when we're looking at, right now, we're doing sort of an environmental community scan by engaging our communities to see what are the gaps. Why are kids being taken? When you think about child and family services, you just don't think about children and families. You think about what impacts those families. Housing, the high cost of food, the ability to care for them in a clean environment, you know, all of these things. So there's a lot with Bill C-92. So Bill C-92 is an opportunity to look at those issues. Then, if you want to trigger Bill C-92, then there's a lot of work to do legislation. Because as you know, as parliamentarians, you have to have things done right in order to, especially when you're taking care of children and family. That takes some time. So we are working on that, but we're also working towards this other piece, which I think goes hand in hand really with Bill C-92. The right to be able to take care of our families it's a huge piece. Tell you a story. Met a young 16-year-old, aging out of care. They gave her a book this size, and they gave her whatever pittance of money and said, "Here you go, this is who you are." Well, she realized that she was a kid, a Métis kid. Her dad was from Buffalo Narrows, Saskatchewan, and the mother was from British Columbia. She had no cultural connection, nor did she know who she was. And this happens every single day. I can walk out of here and walk down to around the mall with all of the people that are unfortunately suffering from mental health. And you'll probably talk to some kids down there that aged out of the system. It's not the provincial government's job or the federal government's job to figure out how to deal with those young people. It was created by churches and governments and stealing our kids and doing all of that. It's our job to be able to learn, to teach them to learn their language, their culture, meet their mushums and their cookums and their families. It's one of the most important things actually in this legislation. Well, we can say, as we are in the indigenous governing body, and we will take care of our own. You didn't do it very well, so we need to do it because we know how to do it.
Ms. Fro, I think you were nodding away there. What did you have to say?
Thank you for the question. I would completely agree with Vice President Leclerc. I think this is an incredibly important part of this bill. And that recognition of our governments as Indigenous governing bodies gives us the tools that we need to be able to utilize C92 if we need it. And that I think is just critically important. And I think that she's done a beautiful job talking about the impact of many different colonial policies. And they're not just, like the 60 scoop really isn't just from the 1960s. There is an industry, there's a child welfare industry, and our children, our Métis children, are very much impacted by this. Bill C-53 recognizes our government's right to actually take care of our own children.
Just what, I guess, how much time? Okay, just like what has prevented the implementation of C-92 to this point? I know many communities in my area have already implemented C-92. They're doing their own care, essentially.
Well, I think that every Indigenous governing body that is looking to C-92 is at a different stage. I know for the Métis Nation of Alberta, I think we're in year 3 of building our authority, building our model of care, our law. It takes time to do it right, and we want to make sure we do it right. We don't want to be left, as soon as we do our coordination agreement and we're saying, okay, we are now the authority over Métis children within Alberta, and then we get a whole bunch of files dumped on us, and we don't want to go there. We know that there are other Indigenous governing bodies in Alberta that's happened to, so we want to make sure that we're doing it the right way. So I don't think it's a matter of it not being implemented, the implementation. I think that community or governing bodies are taking the time to make sure that it's happening correctly, that we're doing the right thing.
Thank you. We're out of time for that one. Mr. McLeod, I see your hand is up. Do you have a point of order or a technical issue?
Yeah, point of order, Mr. I couldn't hardly hear Mr. Viersen. He wasn't speaking into the mic. Maybe just a reminder.
I'll reclaim my
Michael,
time.
You missed nothing, Michael. You missed nothing.
Yeah, I apologize for that, and we'll make sure that our members speak, and any witnesses, make sure you're speaking to the microphone so we can do the proper audio. Thank you for raising that, and sorry I didn't see your hand earlier. Mr. Batiste, you are our final one for today, so the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
I just want to start off by thanking you all for your comments today. It's been amazing. I'm glad to be here for this. You know, I've been listening to great leaders in the Métis for more than 20 years. One of my friends, Jean Taillé, 19 years ago, I first heard her at a conference when I was a university student talking about the Paoli. And then after Daniels, she also was the guest keynote speaker at a conference in Ottawa, and I've learned so much from Jean. And one of the things she's always said to me is that there's a common misconception in Canada that Métis is about mixed ancestry, European and First Nations ancestry. And she said it's important to understand, I don't want to put words in her mouth because I know she's going to be a witness at some point, that Métis are about a distinct community that came together. Can you talk to me a little bit about what the importance of that distinct community is in your regions and why that's an important thing to be clear on?
Yeah.
Margaret, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you very much, honourable member, for the question. And I think that, it ties into actually many of the questions that have been asked today. I think there's a lot of people within Canada that don't understand who we are as a people, which is why we are doing the work that we're doing. And you're exactly right. Our people emerged. We emerged as a new people in these communities that were distinct, that stood apart from their First Nations relatives, that stood apart from their European ancestors as well, and that's exactly why we are recognized as part of the one of the Aboriginal peoples in Section 35. So those distinctness, distinct language, culture, traditions, distinct communities that actually asserted themselves as distinct communities, that's a part of the beautiful and rich history of the Métis. And again, exactly why it is that we are recognized as a distinct people. It's not at all about mixed ancestry. And in fact, that's I think, a common belief. but it doesn't capture the reality that we emerged as a distinct people. And that is why we're here today. That's what Bill C-53 is all about, is recognizing that. Merci.
Yeah, I mean, we did emerge as a new community. I always think of ourselves as the new Canadians, the first Canadians. It was the merging of cultures, and distinctly, we have our own language, culture, values, all of those sorts of things. And the history of our people, which is so important to look at. You know, think back to the days of the buffalo hunts and the way that families hunted together and that sort of thing. There's so many things that make us distinct. A sad part of this whole conversation is when we talk about language. And it's important for you to know that the Michif language is only spoken in 0.5% of households in Saskatchewan. It's going to become an extinct language. Things like Bill C-53 are going to help to regain some of that language. We're doing work with schools and so on and so forth, but we really have to dig down and ensure that we don't lose those really core things that make us who we are. So I don't know if I answered your question or I went all over the place, but...
Do you want to get a chance to answer that about the mixed ancestry and distinct communities?
Yeah, you know, I think President Fro and Vice President Leclerc have said it very eloquently, what it means to be Métis. We are a distinct people. We have our own culture, our own language, our own governance structure. We have all of those things. And one of the things that we haven't talked about is our humor, because we have that too. We were talking about it earlier today, and we are funny people, and we enjoy that. When we think about forgotten people, like I had said earlier, we have, you know, I'll just say that a couple of years ago I was taking a citizenship application in the Region 2 office where I worked. And the lady that was sitting across the table from me showed me her family tree. And her family tree listed my great-great-grandfather. She was denied her culture because a settler who married her great-great-grandmother told her that she couldn't tell her family, she couldn't be Métis anymore. And we cried about it in that office because she was my cousin and she had no idea where she came from. She had no idea that her family fought at the Battle of Batoche. She had no idea that, you know, my grandmother, which would have been an aunt of hers, was born under a Red River cart on a buffalo hunt in southern Saskatchewan. You know, these are the things that Bill C-53 are about, like Vice President Leclerc said, about, you know, preserving our language, preserving our culture so that our children, our grandchildren will know who we are. That's what it's about.
That takes us to the end of the time that we have. There's just a couple of minutes left on the clock, and I do have one item I need to bring to the committee. But so we're done with our questions. But thank you to each of the witnesses for being here today. I think it's a really important start to our study of C-53, and I think you set the stage very well for us. We look forward to, over the next 3 weeks or so, hearing from more witnesses, and then culminating with hearing from the minister and officials. But I'm sure you'll be watching the proceedings very closely, and I just want to share each of you, and I know they're members of your community who are here with you today, for joining us and for the very important testimony that you've given us. So thank you. Colleagues, before we go, I just want to, there was a technical point we missed whenever we met last. What day is today? Tuesday. Whew. It's been brought to my attention that through our routine motions, we require at least 48 hours between submitting amendments and starting clause by clause. We moved the date because of the minister's delayed appearance, and so now we need to move our clause by clause from November 30th to December 5th. I just want to make sure that that's on the record and we're all in agreement with that. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for that. So we will send out any amended notices that are needed. But colleagues, thank you so much for being here. Again, thanks to the witnesses. And folks, we're adjourned.